Welcome to my Bob Thurman podcast. I'm so grateful some good friends enabled me to present them to you. If you enjoy them and find them useful, please think of becoming a member of Tibet House US to help preserve Tibetan culture. Tibet House is the Dalai Lama's cultural center in America. All best wishes. Have a great day.
This is episode 287, Bodhisattvas and the Buddha on Defensive Wars.
Here we are today, solemnly remembering March 10th, 1959, when the Tibetan people in Lhasa responded to a mousetrap posed for them by the Chinese communists, by Mao and Deng Xiaoping, in particular those two, in league with the particular general who was in charge of Chinese troops in Lhasa at that time. And the mousetrap that they did was, His Holiness the Dalai Lama was in the Norbalinka Palace, the summer palace, although it was still only March. And the Chinese general in Lhasa was instructed to invite him for an artistic performance, but told not to bring to the performance any troop or any bodyguard or anybody, but a few members of his family, all totally unarmed, knowing full well that the Tibetans would interpret that as a moment where the Chinese were perhaps, because tension was kind of high at that point, where they would take him away and abduct him, as they had done to many, many spiritual leaders in eastern Tibet already. And the Tibetans knew that. And the Chinese knew they would resist that invitation under those terms. And so the Dalai Lama was kind of kept in the Norbalinka Palace, and then all this rumor went like wildfire through all the Tibetans, and all the citizens of Lhasa came and surrounded the Norbalinka Palace to prevent the Dalai Lama from leaving there, and a huge 100,000 people or whatever. It was a population that's not that huge in Tibet anyway, but maybe hundreds of thousands of people. But the people who didn't go there, smelling a mousetrap, were the remnants of the guerrilla fighters from eastern Tibet, who had been trying to resist the Chinese, because they were ahead of the people in central Tibet, because they had seen the communists taking away everything from everybody, supposedly to help the lowest, poorest members of the community, but then actually taking it to the Chinese, rather, not giving it to these poorest people, just making everybody equally poor, as it turned out. And they were doing that, and they've been fighting, but they'd been pretty much beaten by a well-armed, huge country, industrial, militaristic country, and that had just seasoned and hardened soldiers from having fought Chiang Kai-shek to a victory, standstill, in China over decades, and the Japanese before that. And so then what happened was the Dalai Lama luckily escaped from that place, and then the Chinese put artillery things all around, focused on the Norbalinka and on the crowd, hoping that the remnants of the guerrilla fighters would come in to protect the Dalai Lama from the Chinese, along with all the citizens. But luckily they didn't fall for that. And then also luckily the Dalai Lama escaped and by sort of miracle and a windstorm and so on, by intervention of deities, he went through the Chinese lines and he escaped. And when they figured it out, he was already on his way to exile in India. And then when the minute the Chinese high command, namely Mao and Deng Xiaoping in the committee in Beijing, heard this, that he had escaped, they said to the general, start shelling the people at the Norbalinka before they leave, because they knew that those people would leave if there was no longer the Dalai Lama there to protect. Because they were not actually making a rebellion against the president of the Chinese troops, although they were ready at all times to say leave, and they've been saying that ever since for 63 years. without anybody listening to them. And they've been saying it by fighting for 10 years, sort of like the Ukrainians nowadays are fighting. So then they just massacred a whole bunch of people, maybe 150,000 people in Lhasa, many hundreds of thousands all over Tibet. They canceled all kinds of promises they had made to the Tibetans not to interfere in the Tibetan culture, et cetera, the what they called the local government. But they just then took it over as a communist-run place, and they ignored that there was ever any kind of local government and everything from that time, and they started just annexing the country, And but luckily Dalai Lama escaped, and we all know the story about that. And so there is this knowledge, thanks to him, there is great knowledge of the Tibetan situation in the world, but it does kind of get obscured, even within the Chinese atrocities that they are doing. No wonder Xi is now claimed he's standing with Putin in his destruction of the Ukraine, because the Chinese are doing the same to the Tibetans. They've been doing for 73 years. They've been doing with the Uyghur people, but only lately has it become seen and known that they're doing it with the Uyghurs. So there's been a big fuss about it. But they've been doing it with the Mongolian people. A majority of the Mongolian people live in Inner Mongolia, more than population than in Outer Mongolia, or Buryat, or Tuva, where you have other Mongolian people. And so they've been doing the same, and they're now doubling down, not allowing them to learn the language and all the children, to try to assimilate them into the Chinese thing. So this, in other words, another stage, way advanced stage of a Ukraine-type situation is still happening in Tibet. And it's evidently, but sort of invisibly still. It gets harder to see Tibet, where they block people from really seeing it. And Tibetans are still fighting there, but now they do it non-violently, bless their hearts, in that they will go, someone who gets really beyond and they just have to do something extreme, they go and they burn themselves in front of a police station or in front of a bunch of Chinese troops to show, I will just do myself in, so you can't frighten me by that you're going to kill me. Because I live in a bigger world than this one life, and life is not about dominating people. And then they offer themselves to the fire with that idea. And they don't think they're killing themselves. They feel they are expanding to take a better rebirth. But they're destroying the body that the Chinese think they're controlling them through, if you follow me. So the real freedom resistance has to be by people who are willing to live beyond the body. And in a way, you understand that soldiers are willing, in armies, in war, which now is an obsolete thing on earth. In wars are, dictators like Putin, and like our own CIA people, like the Bush family invading Iraq, or Cheney, who really are kind of wannabe dictators, let's put it that way, even though they were semi-elected. But when they invade a country, people who didn't attack them against the world order, that we realized at the end of the atrocity of the World War and of the A-bombs, which we dropped, not them, we dropped, the end of it. We realized that subliminally the world realized war is impossible because you can't escalate. And you only destroy the other country. You don't tame it or you don't subdue it and get it to work for you. You can't. Everything is too powerful and everybody knows everything. So war is not a Buddhist principle. It's not Gandhi, although they saw it earlier. But in our century, because of our technology, war is no longer, it's obsolete. Read Jonathan Shell, The Unconquerable World. It's proven in black and white as a political science doctrine, not as a religious doctrine. But the reason they can get away with it is that a soldier can be brutalized and trained to sort of offer their body to the fire of war, potential fire. Of course, they try to dodge and survive and kill the other one, but they are ready to die themselves, or they put themselves in harm's way. So the peace people have to stand equally powerfully, which is what Zelensky is doing. President Zelensky of the blessed Ukraine is doing that. And his people are doing that. The Maidan people did that in the Ukraine. And that's what the war people, the dictators, fear that. Because that means that people will be free. They will have a choice in how they are governed. They will not live under corrupt dictators and just be enslaved by them. They will not. They will not serve in immoral, illegal, criminal war. They will not do that. And that's why we're not making the world safe for democracy because we're trying to export America. People can be democratic in their own cultural way. But we are pushing for democracy because dictators piss their own people off by suppressing and oppressing them and putting them in jail if they don't like the dictator. And they then will inevitably make a war on the neighbor because that dictator will try to deflect the resentment of their own people against them for oppressively governing against some made-up enemy by making the people afraid that they'll use propaganda to get the people thinking that somebody else wants to hurt them. Whereas meanwhile, their dictator is the one who's hurting them and robbing them. So it's a trick that has been going on for thousands of years. And it would be still going on, except technology makes it impossible, actually. You know, if the Ukraine invasion by the Russians was just some troops killing some other troops and winning because being more of them, and then they would make the ordinary civilians work for them and give them their wheat for free or whatever, and there's nothing that anybody can do about it. They get away with it. But that isn't the case. Both sides are armed with weapons that are too strong to do like that. And even the civilians will pick up a Stinger missile and blow up your tank. And therefore, all you can do is just destroy the country. You can't win and impose a settlement on them. It's not possible. You just destroy the place. And all that will produce is poverty and terrorism on the few people who do survive. They'll be so mad at you. And so it is worthless. The U.S. did bad things in Iraq and in Afghanistan by occupying the countries. They have a right to go after people who attacked them in those countries, but people who didn't attack them, they have no right to occupy them. They have no right to dictate to them. They have no right. We were very wrong to do that. That was wrong, old-fashioned, obsolete behavior that we did, and of course it failed. And this will fail. Putin will fail. Russian people will win because they will see Putin is a failure. And if he recognizes it sooner, there'll be less destruction. And then his defeat will be less terrible on him than it will be if he persists to try to destroy the whole place. It will be more terrible for him. So on this day, now, we are talking about Tibet because it's March 10th. So I want to read my statement first. I want to read the statement that I've shared with people publicly, and I'll try to put it wherever I can. And I don't do this as the head of any organization or institution. I simply do this as an individual person. Putin's criminal invasion of Ukraine and genocidal speech before it, proposing that Ukraine does not exist and Ukrainians are just renegade Russians, is strongly parallel to the Chinese Communist Party's refusal to acknowledge the undeniable existence of the Tibetan nation as a distinct people with their own culture in their own traditional, historic, thousands of years highland territory. In both cases, that of Ukraine and of Tibet, the dictators of Russia and China seek to justify their colonialist invasion and occupation of a neighboring land and people, and their views and words, and that is the root, their views and words to that effect that they don't exist, is the root of the genocidal wars of invasion and the ethnocidal policy once they occupy. Therefore, when we stand in solidarity with the Ukrainians, today on March 10th, Tibetan National Uprising Day, we should remember the Tibetans, the Mongolians, and the Uyghurs who are suffering the same kind of genocidal oppression at a far different stage from the dictators of China. The Ukrainians are fighting bravely against extreme odds, and it is right for the free world to remember and support them. The Tibetans fought in the 50s in the same way, but the world was different then, and few people knew about it. Today, March 10th, we commemorate the Chinese Communists' final ending of the Tibetan resistance, the massacre of mostly unarmed or poorly armed Tibetan civilians at Lhasa in 1959. Our hearts go out to the hundreds of thousands of Tibetan warriors of that time and of innocent civilians, basically unarmed civilians who were killed in all of that time. That is the main commemoration for them today. But our hearts also go out to the several hundred Tibetan warriors even today who are standing on a spiritual level shoulder to shoulder with the warriors of Ukraine, but who are now fighting non-violently as inspired by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, in the sense that they only give up their own body. They avoid the Chinese having to kill them, but they want to tell the Chinese communists that they are free, and because they can give their own life. They're free to decide when they wish to die and when they don't wish to live under such an oppression. They can decide that because they will remain free beyond the fear of death. And these are the self-immolating, up to 170, number 170 now over the last decade or so, who have immolated their bodies. I never say themselves, because the self doesn't die at death, but they immolate their bodies to show they're still standing for freedom. Nowadays, non-violently, but because they're not harming anybody else, by giving their own bodies to the fire in the face of their oppressors, to assert the essential truth of their freedom in the greater life force beyond the body. We stand in solidarity with all such mistreated people, including the many who have been invaded and harmed in the past by our own governments. Speaking now as an American individual. We warn the invaders and oppressors that their murderous deeds will not be forgotten, even though any sentient being can be forgiven for their madness, even the most crazy and evil. The being can be forgiven, but the deed will not be forgotten, and its consequence will be terrible, as terrible as its effect, as its evil effect. It will bounce back on the perpetrator. We urge them, even for their own sake, to cease and desist at once. The dictator who decided this, basically pretty much a one-person deal in this case, cease and desist at once, as their destruction of others will only end up as destruction of themselves. We pray for them to escape the dictator's self-imprisonment in delusionary isolation, recover their human common sense and see the light, and begin at once the difficult process of reparation for the grievous harms they are inflicting on innocent others. War, conquest, and tyrannical genocide are all obsolete. All these are just so 20th century and before, while this 21st century, as His Holiness the Dalai Lama has wisely advised all of us and all the world leaders over the last decades as a Nobel Peace Prize laureate, this 21st century must be a century of peace, intelligent, democratic, practical human beings resolving conflicts through dialogue, with violence off the table, including the ongoing polluting violence against nature and other animals. May we take this lesson to heart as we watch with horror and skillfully resist the evil and futile destruction of the Ukraine and Ukrainians, and as we deeply commemorate on this special day the tragic invasion, oppression, occupation, and genocidal assimilation and destruction of the Tibetan people. That's me, Robert Thurman, Professor Emeritus, and author of Man of Peace, the book Man of Peace, the illustrated biography of the Dalai Lama of Tibet, which tells the story in all of its graphic detail. So, in a way, the fact that Putin has pushed it in this crazy way to the limit, because he feels the reason he does it, what he's really afraid of, you have to be clear, like what the Chinese imperium, forget about communism, and forget about Russian people and Chinese people, they're fine. They just want to make a living. They want to have a nice time. They want to take care of their children. They don't want to kill other people's children. They don't. It's only these dictatorial beings, like Putin ironically claims he's going to denazify, Zelensky, who's Jewish, and non-observant, he's a humanistic, wonderful, theatrical, artistic, and obviously very courageous Jewish person. And, He pretends but the person who's behaving like a Nazi, like Hitler, is him, Putin, and is a Chinese dictator. Any dictator, Bashar al-Assad in the Sudan, the Maduro in Venezuela, and in the United States, when we have a small clique around the CIA and around certain kind of military-industrial complex, the Iron Cross people that Eisenhower warned us about in the 50s, when they cause like lies and then put us into war and destroy another country like we destroyed Iraq, like we abetted the Europeans destroying Libya. We cowardly didn't prevent the Russians from destroying Syria. You know, when we behave like that as a government, as a country, this is all obsolete. If we knew, our own soldiers wouldn't occupy that country if they knew. They actually warned. I know some soldiers who were there getting rid of the Al-Qaeda, which we had a right to work on in the case of Afghanistan after they attacked 9/11. We had a right to do that, but not to occupy their country. And the soldiers who were there with the getting rid of Al-Qaeda, they warned the Pentagon and those people, don't land soldiers and occupy after once they are free of the Taliban and the Al-Qaeda who are supporting the Al-Qaeda, let them decide their government amongst themselves. Do not enter and occupy the country. They told us. And we didn't listen. And we criminally occupied and foolishly. And we got defeated, didn't we? After wasting so much life and so much limb, so much treasure. Same in Iraq. And indirectly, the destabilization of Syria was caused by climate, actually, initially, but also by us. So I don't want to go into detail on that. I just want to say it's really a strong March 10th commemoration right now, precisely because Putin is showing the world the completely inappropriate, let's just not throw moralistic language, just say utterly inappropriate behavior of an omnipotent tyrant who acts like it's possible to be omnipotent as a human being, whereas it's completely impractical within the modern framework. And he was going to be defeated by cell phones, by information, by people joining a culture of mutual empathy and mutual understanding and mutual interaction, the information age. He was doing pretty good using his dictatorial power in the open worldly society of the internet and the Facebook and Twitter and whatever, corrupting the democracies, which are open societies. And the democracies don't want to fight and kill people, really, basically, unless they're subverted from within, which is a danger. And he was corrupting them effectively with cyber war, an information war. But the point is, he overstepped, and he showed it wasn't just trying to get a little advantage. It was an attempt to oppress and conquer everybody. And that has made it obvious why His Holiness the Dalai Lama is correct to say that in this century, it really, starting in 1945, really, after the use of an atomic bomb on civilians, which is state terrorism. After the use of that, war is obsolete, basically. And, the reason Putin has not been controlled is because he threatens to use nuclear weapons on somebody. And then everybody freaks out because they know that's impossible. But that's the whole thing is impossible, a dictatorial government. Chinese people left to themselves will struggle, quarrel, they'll have parliaments, they'll argue with each other, like in Taiwan. They even sometimes have fights in the Parliament House. Like, I would like to see Chuck Schumer and Mitch McConnell in a cage match. I'd like to see that. That would be fun. Then instead of filibustering and not governing the country because they just want to fight they want to have a campaign all the time. They don't want to be a loyal opposition like where the Republicans are today. So we can't have dictators. It's not conceivable in the modern world. There is no omnipotent. Even God is not omnipotent because he has to send Jesus to help us. Even, none of them are omnipotent. There's no such thing as an omnipotent person. Buddha is not omnipotent. You can be omniscient. You can know everything. And what you know is you can't do everything to everybody. You can't make everybody else do everything. Because every one of them wants to be free. Every one of them wants to be happy. And they have a right to be, every living being. So the point is, the individual who stands up for freedom, like President Zelensky and his friends and his circle and his administration, and individual Ukrainian mothers and fathers and grandfathers who stand against being completely crushed and ripped off by this dictatorial thing, and who would love for their relatives and dear friends among the Russian people to be as free as they can be. Not only do they would like to be in something like the European Union, but they would like the Russians to be in a European Union, not ruled by corrupt oligarchs, who really, the root of their power is the corrupt control of nuclear weapons, but which we shouldn't fear because no one can use them. They are not possible to use because no one who is still human would ever use one. Absolutely not. Our doing so was a crime against nature and against humanity, the 2 times that we did, and we've never done it again, and we would never do it, and no one would ever do it. And Putin is not that crazy. As the president of Finland, who knows him very well, said, he is pretending to be crazy to get away with his old-fashioned, obsolete behavior. So I'm commemorating the Tibetan heroism, and not the failed uprising, although I'm commemorating those who lost their lives trying to resist, standing up for freedom, for truth. Yes, but I'm commemorating them by standing in solidarity with the Ukrainians today, as every Tibetan hero is also doing. And every Uyghur one, and every Mongolian one, and every Chinese one, ultimately, and every Russian one. Ultimately, the real Russian heroes are the people in the street being beaten up by police. Eventually, there'll be the police who will refuse to beat up their own grandmother on the order of this. When their grandmother comes out, they will refuse. And they did it once, or we know the Russians can do it because they did it once in 1990, 1991, when Yeltsin stood up on the tank and when the people went out in the street and they stopped the KGB from their oppressive control and oppression and impoverishment of their country and of their lives. So they can do it again, and they will. That's what really Putin is fighting. Rearguard action against consciousness, raising the consciousness of the individual in the 21st century, which is the beauty of life, the fragility and the preciousness of the planet, the wish to become responsible in the use of our technology, where we don't pollute and destroy the climate and destroy the balance and the source of our life. These are also petro-dictators, petro-state dictators. They are no longer accessible. Saudi Arabia needs true democracy. If they have a royal family, it has to be an ornamental one, purely ornamental like the one in England or Japan. Cannot have political power. Because one person, when they think they're omnipotent, they are going to mistreat people. This is shown today, graphically, to everyone. And let's take that lesson and let's resist that all full force. I feel compelled to share with somebody the thinking in Buddhist circles about a war of defense. In fact, Buddhism does not have a holy war doctrine or theory because it doesn't consider war can ever be holy. War sucks in general because there's the fog of war, the whole thing. Many things happen that nobody intended, who starts the war, who fights the war. Therefore, aggressive war is simply, there is no possibility of its being holy. That is an unfortunate aspect of people who have a religious tradition where they think that somehow they're supposed to convert other people to it, and if people are not a member of their tradition, they should be exterminated in some way, corrected in some way, converted in some way. And that's not, Buddhism doesn't believe in that. And so there's no holy war doctrine. And for years I even said there was no fighting doctrine of any kind. And then I discovered I was wrong because it's a huge literature. And eventually my friend Samdong Rinpoche, who was the prime minister of Tibetan government in exile for 8 years, and before that a very famous and important scholar in India, founded the Central University of Tibetan Studies, and so on. Really great guy. I've known him since, nearly teenagehood. We lived in the same house when we were both in our 20s. And he discovered, and then my friend Geshe Jumspel translated, the Bodhisattva Gochara, etc., which means the field or the range of the Bodhisattva. Sutra, which is a sutra in Buddha's time, with Buddha appearing and Buddha asking a certain person called Satyavati, the truthful one, to give a theory of a just defense when it is allowed in a way by Buddhist nonviolent ethics to defend yourself when invaded by another country, which of course is the condition of the Ukraine. So I'm doing this in the context of our struggle with the Ukraine. And really the Ukrainians struggle with the Russians, let's put it that way. Their dire necessity of trying to defend themselves against the overwhelming Russian force, and the Russian force being used with impunity by, I don't think a madman, but someone who feigns aggressive madness in order to, berserkerhood, which is an old war strategy, who feigns berserkerhood to intimidate the enemy. And I noted that the president or prime minister of Finland cleverly said that he thought that President Putin was a sane person who was feigning insanity, and that would be feigning the berserker mode. Like that Alexander the Great supposedly would go berserk before a battle, and that way, spur his troops into more vigorous action than they otherwise perhaps would have manifested. In this conflict, the Ukrainians are the ones who are more forceful as individual troops, because they are fighting to defend their homeland, and they are not the aggressive ones, and they have been aggressed upon, and they are, and it was announced that they are considered not to exist by the aggressor. He gave a speech where he said he never agreed that there was such a thing as a Ukrainian country, in which the disagreement, he is agreeing with the czars, the Russian czars, not only Lenin or Stalin, Stalin killed millions of Ukrainians to rob their food during the war, and at other times they've had horrendous things they've done, Russians have, to the Ukrainians when they had USSR connection, And that's why Ukrainians decided not to be a republic within the Russian Federation, but to be an independent country, which they have always wanted to be. They have always been for hundreds of years, not for recently, not just recently. Nobody just granted the Ukrainians independence. They have been independent forever. And the Russians have tried to absorb them and swallow them and assimilate them forever. So Putin is only repeating an old Russian mantra of the Ukrainians have to be Russians because we want that land. We want to get to the Black Sea. We want all that agricultural land and so on. And we want to make the Ukrainians learn Russian, period, and forget their slightly different Slavic language. French, Italian and Spanish. The Italians should claim the Spanish or should really speak Italian and vice versa because they're very, very close. And they're coming from Latin, And Slavic languages, wherever they come from, maybe from Sanskrit, actually, they're also very, very close. So, in the Slavic language family. So this is the problem. Now, one note that has not been introduced in this issue is the nonviolence note of the Buddhists. And in this sutra, Satyavati, he tells what is the Buddhist theory of self-defense. And that is, if you're invaded by an enemy king, he's talking in terms of ancient society, so an enemy king, he says. And if you are invaded by an enemy king, your job is to decide whether you can resist that invitation. If you're completely overwhelmed, with really only a self-immolating type, suicide attack type of ability to defend yourself, then you should not defend yourself violently. You should surrender. Because if you don't, then more violence occurs, because you will kill some of the invading soldiers, you will draw blood from the invaders, but you will inevitably lose, and thereby the invaders will oppress, and when they oppress you and they institute whatever regime they plan to over your kingdom, they will be more violent and more oppressive than they would if you hadn't resisted. And in a case where they have threatened to kill your leader, then I guess going along with that, if we extrapolate it into that circumstance, not make a subsidiary king out of the neighboring king, which would be the ancient method. But the modern method would be the modern situation is Putin claimed he just wanted to kill Zelensky, the Jewish Zelensky, who he claimed was a Nazi, and so he threatened with assassination, really, the president. So in that case, if that were the case, then actually Zelensky should have surrendered, told his people to surrender, and left the country to avoid the assassination. Maybe set up for them a government in exile if there was an appetite to do that. But, he should have done that so that the terms of oppression would be lessened and less bloodshed overall would occur. However, Zelensky made the judgment, which I concur in personally, to my surprise, that the Ukrainians definitely want Ted. They had showed that in the Maidan, in the so-called Orange Revolution, which was not provoked by the United States. The reason the United States would not provoke such a thing is that, and it's completely false, pretending that other people agitated it. That's just Putin saying that the Ukrainians themselves have no agency, which is a disrespect and it's kind of genocidal attitude about the Ukrainians. They don't exist, so they couldn't have wanted to be free, right? Whereas actually they did want to be free. They overthrew against a very strong Yanukovych using Russian backing to oppress them, just like the guy in Belarus that just did kill a lot of people and is torturing many more right now, I'm sure, because he was voted out of office and he wouldn't accept that because he's one of these horrendous dictators. And then the Russians came in and backed him up. He might have had to accept it, except the Russians backed him up. And they came in and they showed his people how to shoot their own people who protested and torture them, intimidate them, knock down even an international airline to imprison one of them, their leaders. So, in other words, in this case, Zelensky felt the Ukrainians would be able to defend themselves. Of course, they did need weapons, and they did need assistance from others in the form of weaponry, which they were receiving. Our traitorous Benedict Arnold Trump, who I never call president because he never was, because he never agreed to abide by an election. So therefore, the fact that he got a few numbers and he was able to move into the House, basically move his business into our president's house, and then want to stay there forever as a dictator, that's not serving as a president. He's a traitor, Benedict Arnold, and he betrayed us to the Russians, and he was betraying the Ukrainians by withholding their arms and not allowing their president to have a meeting with him and not showing the Russians that we would support them, although we wouldn't fight for them. Okay, Justin. And we didn't have to have them in the NATO in order to fight, in order to support them, however, as a free country. As our mandate to support democracies in the world. That's our mandate, America's foreign policy mandate. So, and not only that, but also support democracy in America is our mandate, which we have to return to now. We are returning to now. So anyway, he says, therefore, if you can resist this invader, do resist him and expel him. But when you expel him, when you get him, push him out past your border, and he's of course thinking in terms of old-fashioned war, where you're dealing with an army to army. And don't pursue him back into his country and invade his country. Stop at the border. Let him know you could pursue him, but don't. And then impose a treaty of non-future invasion on him under certain penalties, perhaps some reparations or something like that, because you defeated him in his effort to conquer your country. So that's the theory of a just defense. In other words, it's a theory intended to minimize violence and minimize collateral damage and loss of life, even loss of life within the militaries, of both sides, actually, because it's operated in an awareness that actually the common citizens of almost all countries don't really want to die to fight for their kings, except defensively. If they feel their own house and their own way of life is being invaded, their own families will be raped and destroyed and so forth, then they will fight. Then they have a license to fight. But they don't want to go fighting on wars of invasion where they might die just to increase territory or something. Because they're not really survival necessary, and it's just a game of bad kings, basically, has been for thousands of years, pretty much. A few emperors in between, a few empires in the old days, which they could get away with. But now it has been, in the modern time now, of course, so that's the Buddhist view of the just defense. And in that light, therefore, we can consider the Ukrainians justly defending themselves, as they've shown over 2 weeks that vastly outnumbered and outmachined, equipment-wise, they have still defended themselves. They've lost some parts here and there. And of course, the only way they really have lost is by a completely criminal war crime or crime against humanity method of the Russians of attacking civilians and destroying civilian infrastructure and killing civilians and threatening and intimidating them. That's been the method. And now just to sidestep a little bit before coming to my thought on that. Modern warfare is completely illegitimate, and it's actually what I would call so 20th century and earlier, and not proper in the 21st century, as was proven toward the end of the 20th, actually, and in the beginning of the 21st by several bad criminal invasions. The first, worst one, engaged in by the U.S., where we invaded Iraq without having been attacked by Iraq. That was, and I don't mean the first Bush. The first Bush was repelling the Kuwaitis from Kuwait. I mean the Iraqis from Kuwait. And that was a legitimate defense assistance of the Kuwaiti government. But the second one, invading the Cheney-Bush, and I put that in that order for the blame, the Cheney-Bush invasion of Kuwait, Bush Jr. invasion of Kuwait, is a war crime. I'm sorry. It's a crime against humanity. All it did was destroy a lot of people, a lot of infrastructure, some lives of the invaders, but mostly the lives of and it totally imbalanced the whole situation and caused several reverberating wars, including the Syrian one, probably to the degree that it went. So it was a wreckage of the entire heartland of the Middle East, and therefore crime against humanity. I think Americans have to embrace and own up to that, to understand Putin's madness. The Italians and the French maybe should own up to the destruction of Libya, just because they had a somewhat bad dictator. He had given up his nuclear weapons. He was shouting and screaming about being voted out of office and freaking out. So there was some justification in defending democracy, Obama letting them go ahead and maybe aiding them in some ways. But basically, again, the invasion of Libya and the destruction of Libya and the turning it into a war zone from having been a badly administered but still peaceful country, basically, with its former aggressions outside having been compensated for to some extent. That was the second crime. Apparently that one very much upset Mr. Putin. And then the Syrian thing, the Russians are very much to blame. And Putin now is totally and 100% to blame. Georgia and Ukraine, starting 2014 and culminating now in his attempt to completely destroy the Ukrainians, which he is failing to do. And we are rightly arming them as fast as we can. Okay, so that should be, but what should be acknowledged here is His Holiness the Dalai Lama's instruction to world leaders today, which they should listen to. It doesn't matter he doesn't have a country. It doesn't matter they're not Buddhists. He gives a proper description of what the 21st century has to be, namely a century where disagreements and problems, such as between Putin and European Union member state of Ukraine, leaving out issue of NATO, but member of Ukraine of the European Union, which is what the Ukrainians wanted. And he denied them, and his puppet Yanukovych denied them, and that's what brought in but about the Orange Revolution, not American meddling. That's what bothered them. And Putin has actually been at war with the European Union by backing Brexit indirectly, by backing the Nazi Party in Germany, by backing the Marine Le Pen, the people who want to break up the European Union in France, and the Five Star who want to break up the European Union from Italy. He's been aggressing, totally, waging multi-information war, cyber war against the European Union and political interference. And it's the typical difficult thing of a dictatorship using the openness of democracies to try to corrupt them from within and install fellow dictators and puppet dictators of their own in those countries in order to guarantee their continuing control over their own people who don't really want to be ruled by a dictatorship in the 21st century. And these are supposedly, and Putin at least is honest, he doesn't pretend to be communist like the Chinese do, when he's actually more admires the Tsar, and he's more like a Christian fundamentalist imperialist for Russia. He doesn't even like Lenin and communism. So the dictatorship of the proletariat turned back into the good old Tsarist imperialism under Putin, is what we could be clear about. And the point is, in general, peaceful times, democracies are at a disadvantage in that sort of situation because they're open. And so Russian oligarchs can come and buy politicians, they can buy governments, they can use their over concentration of wealth by oppressing their own Russian people to over ownership of all the resources of the country, to oppressing the Russian people and not allowing middle class entrepreneurship really to flourish by grabbing all the profits from everything. Then they go out and buy things in the other countries and make those governments compliant to them and try to wreck any more sane national socialist, let's call it, or, democratic socialist country like the European Union countries are. So we have to acknowledge that. So then our resistance to Putin in the Ukraine and backing the Ukrainian bravery of standing up to him personally, following the law, even the nonviolent Buddhists argue, because they're pragmatic nonviolent Buddhists. They're always seeking to minimize violence, not pretending that there's any such thing as an absolute nonviolence. They're attempting to minimize. And we must do that. But now we come into, so the second thing is, one, war itself is hopeless. Therefore, any country where the government has the control of information, no freedom of speech, no freedom of assembly, no freedom of media, and therefore can brainwash their population to be completely out of touch with reality and think that and create fear in their population by pretending there's big enemies ringing them all around that want to harm them, and thereby can mobilize aggressive war and attempt to create empire. That's simply unacceptable. And therefore there is the battle that Biden so beautifully expresses on the planet today, which is a new cold and now at the moment hot war. It's a war between autocracies and democracies. And China and Russia are the two bad autocracies. Russia, perhaps the worst one at this moment. China may be undecided. It is a very bad one, as it shows on its way it treats the Tibetans, the way it treats the Uyghurs, the way it treats the Mongolians. It's bad. It showed that already, but it hasn't attacked, and then it just did it to Hong Kong. But it otherwise doesn't attack, any kind of other nation yet. I mean, India a little bit, but not full scale, not yet. It obviously will. It showed its intention to, especially if Russia were to get away, that it would. Taiwan, people say. But Taiwanese will also defend themselves. They're also very capable of defending themselves. And they're not easily going to be able to. And Japan and we in Australia and India will help them. So that's not going to be easy for them, as they are now seeing Ukraine as no pushover for Russia. Russia doesn't want to push over the Ukraine. They want to be friends with them. The clique, the KGB, FSB clique, headed by the Tsarist Putin want to overthrow them because it's part of this process of trying to get rid of the whole European Union and reestablishing a Russian empire. Now we come to the 21st century, how it should be a time of dialogue and free speech and people justifying what they do reasonably and negotiating and compromising. And there's a very easy compromise with Ukraine. The European Union, could accept them as members, could offer to the Russians membership also in the European Union, but they'd have to meet democratic standards. You'd have to release the media to have a free media. You'd have to allow true elections and election monitors. They'd have to allow freedom of speech and assembly. They couldn't just monopolize all power by the oligarchs in order to enter the European Union. Neither could Ukraine. Ukraine would have to apply, has applied, and will hopefully be accepted soon, even before their infrastructure is completely crushed. Russians do have the ability to flatten, like they did Syria, like they helped Assad do in Syria. They could flatten the whole country, obliterate its whole infrastructure, and genocide lots of Ukrainians. That still would not stop those that survive from fighting them, so it would just be useless for them. They would have wrecked an asset on a friendly basis that Russia had as friends, as a producer of grain and skill and industrial productions of things. They would have turned that into a ruined place that someone would have to repair instead, because so it's totally asinine, and eventually Russian people would know that, and hopefully then they really would insist, as they did in the 90s, on overthrowing the kleptocracy, the KGB, FSB run, CIA type, Russian CIA type run government, like they did in the 90s. They did that. And some of their own leaders from within the Communist Party, Gorbachev, enabled them to do that. He did that, and Yeltsin. But now we have the issue of the terrorism practiced by this clique in Russia, the Communist Party, the oligarchy, the Kremlin oligarchy in charge of Russia, of threatening the West and the world with nuclear attacks. And then everybody's shying away as far as the real moving into more strongly support the Ukrainians' bravery, which is defending the European Union itself, actually. Because that's what this issue is about. This all started with the Ukrainian effort to join the European Union. It was not NATO, it was the European Union. In order to have government monitored from outside as keeping democracy alive and not succumbing to Russian installed oligarchs, which they had a number of them. So now we can't really support him with a no-fly zone, for example, which they're begging us for, because he can bomb and flatten them with impunity with planes. And we can't do it with our pilots. We can give planes, well, that's on the edge of it, but not pilots. And we can't enforce a no-fly zone because that could lead to nuclear war. We are threatened. We are not threatening them with nuclear war. We're threatening, our deterrent is nuclear retaliation. But he's then feigning madness to intimidate us. And this intimidation, along with the hardship of shifting away from Russian gas and oil in Europe and things like that, and also the pressure put on people like Boris Johnson, other by the Russian oligarchs who own Londongrad, not to mention someone like Deripaska, an oligarch who has a big factory in Kentucky and owns Mitch McConnell, or they own Trump, and they have luckily they now being blocked on the internet. They can't aid the insanity movement in America, which is a good thing. One of my writing heroes, Umair Haq, has pointed that out beautifully, that Twitter is much cleaned up, and maybe Facebook, I don't know, because I don't follow that well. But my point is, then we have to rely on our deterrent, and we have to judge Putin more skillfully, that the kind of insanity he has does not override self-preservation on his part. It's been since childhood he was known as someone who, because of smallness of size physically, he's not big and tall, didn't weigh 250 pounds and so on, he would, in a schoolboy quarrel or gang fight or something, he would always escalate and terrorize the opposing gang by, taking out a broken bottle or something to really bloody and even kill somebody who wanted to just have a fight with him and his friends. He was known for that. But he didn't get killed. He didn't kill anybody, as far as we know. At that time, now he's killing people. But he, on the other hand, he has his own plan for himself. He has a sense of destiny. He's going to restore the Tsarist Empire. It isn't really the USSR, it's the Tsarist Empire, people have to be clear. A Christian, Tsarist, white empire. So it's really basically Nazism, a Russian version of Nazism, and backed by weird philosophers like Ilyin and Dugin, and people, we should be aware of that. So he can threaten nuclear, but he won't use nuclear. So we can be a little braver in the margins of supporting the Ukrainians, is what I wanted to say. So that's what I wanted to say, those things. We should definitely get planes to the Ukrainians as fast as possible. Maybe we could help them hire mercenary pilots that weren't actually in the U.S. Air Force. And it's good that we cut off all the Russian cyber war people. And we should be very alert to any moles they have in other non-Russian countries that could still, robot us and screw up our information and spread disinformation in Europe and in America, to hold out in a longer run against this czarist imperialist effort by the KGB people. Okay? So I just thought that I haven't seen complete clarity in this. Some old-fashioned 20th century sort of great Russian, experts, quote unquote, are quoted on CNN and places talking about, oh yeah, well, we really provoked them with NATO. Never mind NATO. NATO was there to protect against the Soviet Union's occupation of half of the Warsaw Pact and all of their invasion and their staying in Eastern Europe. Notice America did not put puppet governments and stay in Western Europe. It allowed Western Europe to be fully democratic, sent money with the Marshall Plan. Yes, it left some troops to help them defend themselves, making them maybe lazy, especially everybody wanted Germany to be lazy about defending itself, not to be militarized, but in a way making them lazy about paying for their own defense. But that was just in a rebuilding phase. And the expansion of it just had to do with the fact that the Yeltsin-Gorbachev movement to make Russia truly democratic was defeated by the FSB, the KGB, who put themselves back in as oligarchs to control things, who therefore we can still measure aggression from them. And we haven't really noticed the level of aggression interfering in our 2016 election, which they 100% did, interfering now with the craziness and these conspiracy theories, etc., which history will eventually see was very much aided and abetted by them, using Twitter and Facebook and things like that themselves, pretending to be your Aunt May, telling you false things, and brainwashing people into craziness. Therefore they still interfered in the 2020 election. Otherwise, people were really fed up with the mismanagement by the Trump business. I don't call him president. He was not president because he never agreed to the terms of democratic election. At the first election, he said he wouldn't accept it unless he won. The second election, he said he wouldn't accept it unless he won, and then he didn't accept it. He tried to overthrow. So that proves he never was operating within our system as president. People should be clear on that. And he's remained an asset of the Russians, as he showed by his delight in Putin's invasion of Ukraine, which he openly manifested. And his mouthpieces, like Tucker Carlson and Hannity and those people who are just his mouthpieces, are also Benedict Arnold's, mouthing Russian military propaganda. And I personally believe that the Russian people would by now have turned those protests into uncontrollable, because the police, secret police or the regular police, would be unwilling to beat them all up if they had the real knowledge of what he's really doing, of what he's really using the Russian military to do in Ukraine, killing their relatives en masse. But they don't know that. They're being told it's a police action and all kind of fake news they're getting. Talk about super fake news. They're getting it from the Kremlin by having shut down all independent media and made it practically a capital offense to speak the truth. So that's where we are. So the Buddhists say support the comedian, save the cheerleader, and free the world and save the world. That's where we are. And this statue there, the picture that I have to my over my shoulder, is the wonderful Tibetan sculpture of the face of the Buddha Maitreya, the future Buddha, which means the planet will be here a few thousand years from now with societies that will still speak Sanskrit, they'll still speak English, and they'll still speak Russian. And we're not going to be wiped out in a nuclear holocaust, and we're going to actually have a great 21st century when this kind of oligarch type run countries have turned to more democratic countries where people will have their way, which is not to go killing each other, to make a living and to share with each other and to have a nice time and play video games or whatever. Watch Olympics. And that's Maitreya, the future Buddha. He'll be the loving one. He'll be there. And that's the wheel of time behind me up there. And that also says that we've been in a series, 20th century was a series of a lot of final wars. And in the 21st, spillover from that happened in the criminal invasion of Iraq by the United States, and now the criminal invasion of Georgia and Ukraine by Tsarist Russia. And they have to stop both of them. And we have to own up to ours, and we have to punish. Obama was wrong to turn the page without punishing any of the leaders who had falsified reality in order to drag us into a criminal war, which is against the UN to invade someone who hasn't attacked you. Preemptive war is a criminal doctrine, not a good logical New Age doctrine. It's criminal. So that's really just 20th century spilling over into 21st, as is Putin's attempt to Tsarist Russia, and as will be China's attempt to invade India or invade Siberia or the various places they really can invade. And they want to, they plan to, if things keep going well for autocrats. Because they have to, you understand, this is why the dictatorship no longer functions. It's like military connects to a dictator type of king in traditional political theory. And traditional type of king uses war to deflect resentment of people if that king is too oppressive on his own people. So that's a connection of dictatorial kingship and war. And then if you have either dictatorship of proletariat or some attempt to resurrect some imperialist dictatorship like Tsarist dictatorship, then what that is trying to continue that situation in a time when, because of the power of weapons and the power of knowledge, Facebook, Twitter, people knowing about what each other's lives are like and wanting to have decent lives themselves, and women having more say in societies that are more free. And that's in that situation, such dictatorial government, and you can only have celebrity kingship, who are like movie stars or something, but don't have political power. That's okay. And then, responsible democratic politics with prime ministers and presidents and things. You can have that. And then that can get corrupted. It has to be cleaned up all the time and blah, blah, and that goes on. But you don't have the autocrat who can really falsify the whole life you create, an alternate reality within their country, and then send people out to kill other people and be killed themselves. That's no longer doable on our planet. It's obsolete. Jonathan Shell proved it without Buddhism, based on the Velvet Revolution and based on analysis of von Clausewitz, for you political scientists. The Unconquerable World, he called it. Brilliant work. And I'm arguing it from a Buddhist point of view as well. And it should be clear in common sense point of view, because that is that Buddhist point of view. That was Jonathan Shell's point of view. When you can only destroy the neighboring country, war is no longer viable, one. And two, when war upon escalation leads to both sides losing, war is no longer viable, either one. So thank you very much. I dedicate the merit of this to everyone becoming enlightened Not everyone becoming Buddhist, that's not necessary. Everybody becoming enlightened in the terms of their own common sense and kindness and good heart. And President Putin, you have a good heart somewhere. You like to go fishing in Tuva. You like to ride your horses, whatever. You have fun, have your fun. And you can arrange to not be, we're not executing W for wrecking Iraq and Cheney. We might charge them a little something, some reparation fees, and we're not going to execute you. So you can back down and minimize the damage you are causing, which will just bounce back on you, and find your good heart and your happiness and control that savage temper of yours. Okay, you can do that. We're confident you can. You should and you must. Don't bother with brandishing weapons that you cannot use. No one can use. We can't, you can't. And cool down, okay? And let's have a peace quicker so we destroy less nice houses, less nuclear power plants, less fields, less people. Okay? All the best. Dedicate that merit.
This episode of the Bob Thurman podcast was recorded live at Menla Mountain Retreat in the heart of the Catskills in Phoenicia, New York. To learn how to support this podcast and about upcoming programs with Robert Thurman and friends, in person and online, please visit our websites at bobthurman.com, thus.org, and menla.org. Interstitial music generously supplied by Tenzing Chogyal. All rights reserved, used with the artist's permission. Tashi Delek, and thanks for tuning in.